The sun hammered Redemption Ridge with the malevolent intensity of a judgment baking the granite until the air itself seemed to quiver and warp like flawed glass. It wasn't merely the wind that carried whispers here. The heat itself felt alive, a suffocating presence sighing through the tinder dry grass, clinging precariously to the rocky soil, swirling around the corners of the small, defiant cabin with a sound that amplified the profound quiet within. For Eliza Moore, this oppressive silence was a constant gaping wound, a monument to the vibrant absence of Samuel's easy laughter. 2 years. 2 bleached, desolate years since the shadowed depths of Redemption Canyon nearby had unleashed its stony fury, a monstrous cascade of fractured rock and splintered ancient timbers that claimed her husband, burying him, along with his fierce, stubborn hope for a future carved from this unforgiving land. That cataclysm had followed the earlier, quieter devastation, the relentless fever that stole their infant son Thomas, leaving an ache so profound it felt like a phantom limb, a hollow space. Samuel's steadfast presence had only barely managed to fill, now crude stone markers beneath the ridge's sentinel, a gaunt lightning-scarred pine clawing at the relentless sky, were all that testified to their brief existence. What remained for Eliza was the shimmering, distorting heat, the ever-present dust settling like a fine gray shroud, and the grounding rhythmic motion of her own capable hands. The unnerving feeling had started subtly days ago, a flicker at the edge of vision, dismissed as heat haze or darting lizards. Then the unmistakable snap of a twig from the dense scrub oak beyond the clearing on a windless afternoon. Nerves, she'd told herself, the stark silence breeding phantoms in a lonely mind. But yesterday morning, pulling the heavy bucket from the stone-lined well, the damp earth beside the coping stones told a different story. 2 distinct boot prints pressed deep too large for her own carelessly placed, not Samuel's worn soles. 2 fresh and glinting dully, where one print disturbed the weeds, lay a single spent rifle cartridge. Brass rimfire, a caliber she didn't recognize, certainly not from Samuel's carefully maintained Winchester, a chill entirely separate from the cool, well water snaked down her spine. Someone had been close, watching. That evening, she checked the stout wooden bar on the door twice and found herself running an unnecessary cleaning rag over the smooth action of the Winchester. The familiar weight, a grim comfort. Survival was stitched together from harsh necessity. Eliza lived by the needle, her existence measured in the meticulous repair of ripped canvas grain sacks bound for the Harrison Ranch down valley. The reinforcement of strained leather saddlebags for itinerant prospectors, the endless patching required by life lived against the grain of this relentlessly harsh country. Each deliberate stitch felt like a tiny victory against erosion, both of cloth and of spirit, a small anchor cast against the overwhelming tide of solitude. Currency was a phantom, but the hard-bitten ranchers and infrequent wary travelers bartered flour, coffee, salt, and crucially cartridges. Trips to the dusty settlement sprawled in the valley below were infrequent, deliberately curtailed. Down there lay the suffocating weight of pitying glances, the awkward pauses, and the ambushing memories clinging to every familiar corner post and saloon door. Up here, embraced by the stark, impersonal grandeur of the ridge, her grief was her own immense silent companion, untamed as the landscape itself. Samuel had raised this cabin log by sturdy log, his strong hands equally adept with the heavy bite of an axe and the gentle reassurance around her waist. His pipe, its briar, bowl darkened, and smooth from constant use, lay perpetually on the rough mantelpiece, an untouchable relic. In the deepest, most consuming quiet of the long nights, furnace hot, even after sundown, she sometimes found herself reaching, driven by a desperate, irrational hope to catch the lingering, ghostly sweet scent of his particular tobacco, blend a phantom of solace lost. His oiled Winchester rifle hung ready on sturdy wall pegs, a ritual of maintenance she performed automatically, a subconscious inheritance of his deeply ingrained watchful caution, now amplified by her own rising unease. The stifling afternoon air grew heavier, pregnant with unspoken menace as thunderheads began to curdle over the distant peaks, painting the western sky in bruised purples and livid grays. The tense humming quiet abruptly fractured, the sharp grating jangle of approaching spurs against rock. Eliza shielded her eyes against the glare, her needle freezing mid-stitch over a torn piece of heavy canvas. A lone rider slowly climbed the steep track, alkali dust boiling up lethargically behind his horse's hooves like disturbed spirits. Kyle Branner. Her stomach instinctively tightened into a cold, hard knot. Branner more than just hired muscle from the sprawling Harrison holdings. Down Valley trailed trouble like a foul odor clings to damp wool. He carried himself with a bully's practice swagger, masking a simmering, volatile resentment that perpetually sought provocation. There had always been a veiled contempt in the way he looked at Samuel, a flicker of something ugly and deeply personal. Eliza couldn't quite decipher, hinting at sour history, unspoken, perhaps deals gone bad, or slights magnified by jealousy. Samuel had just called him mean right through. He swung down from his lathered horse with deliberate insolent slowness, letting the reins trail carelessly in the dust. A small, deliberate assertion of dominance. His small, calculating eyes performed a swift, dismissive inventory. The cabin, the meager signs of her solitary existence, the waiting Winchester leaning near the door, before finally settling on her, a look hovering somewhere between a sneer and outright predatory hunger. "Afternoon, widow," he drawled, his voice possessing the texture of rocks grinding together, rough and grating. "Sun finally bakes some sense into you up here." Eliza remained seated on the rough plank bench outside the door, the heavy canvas resting on her lap like a shield. "Branner," she acknowledged coolly, her voice deliberately level, betraying none of the sudden tightness in her chest. "State your business." He adjusted his gun belt with unnecessary deliberation, drawing attention to the worn leather and the heavy Colt nestled within. "Business concerns a debt Samuel owed the old man Harrison. $200 seems prospecting on another man's staked land costs extra." He took a deliberate step closer, aggressively invading her personal space. The rank smell of stale sweat, cheap whiskey, and underlying malice rolled off him in waves. "Old man Harrison ain't known for patience. Reckon he wants. What's his plus interest for the inconvenience?" Eliza's brow furrowed, the needle clutched tight in her fist. Utterly wrong. Samuel perpetually poor? Yes, but pathologically honest. He'd lose sleep over owing a nickel. And Harrison Samuel actively disliked the man, considered him grasping dishonorable, a land hog. He wouldn't borrow from him unless backed into the bleakest corner imaginable. And even then, he would have confessed it to her in the dark hours. "You are mistaken," she said, her voice quiet, but unwavering steel. Samuel held no such debt with Harrison. He wouldn't touch Harrison's money. Branner emitted a short bark-like laugh, devoid of any real humor. "Think Sam told his little wife everything about him finding Harrison's lost survey stake, maybe about tapping into ground that weren't his to claim, about the supplies he took on credit after his first hole played out worthless. He leaned closer, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial rasp, laced with venomous insinuation. Face it, widow. Sam was desperate. Harrison's got the paper signed and dated. Besides the loan. Harrison heard things. C heard. Sam stumbled onto something real big just before that convenient rock slide conveniently buried his tracks. Something worth killing for maybe. Maybe something detailed. On, oh, say a map. The word struck Eliza like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. Map. The carefully folded oiled buckskin, hidden deep within Samuel's wooden chest beneath his spare flannel shirt. The crudely drawn canyon fork, the sharp X, the cryptic coordinates written in Samuel's hand. N37, W105, LAT, Her blood turned to ice water sluicing through her veins. He knew or suspected enough to gamble his life and hers on it. There's nothing here for you. She repeated, her voice, dangerously thin, tight as a newly strung wire. She pushed herself to her feet, the canvas sliding unheeded to the dust, her hand inching imperceptibly towards the Winchester propped against the wall. Leave my property now. Branner's eyes narrowed into venomous slits. The thin facade of civility vanished, utterly replaced by raw greed and simmering violence. Playin' tough. Maybe Sam did leave something behind besides debt and a grieving widow. Harrison wants that map. Says it rightfully belongs to the partnership Sam betrayed when he struck out on his own. Partnership. Samuel, Nathan, and Branner. The thought was vile impossible. He sent me to collect one way or another. His gaze flickered with open avarice towards the cabin door, as if he could smell the hidden buckskin through the logs. Get out! Eliza reiterated, standing her ground, though her heart hammered a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs, threatening to crack them. He lunged surprisingly fast for his thick-set build. His hand clamped onto her upper arm like a blacksmith's vice fingers digging mercilessly into the flesh. She cried out a sharp gasp of pain and shock, stumbling backward as he hauled her violently off balance. Raw, paralyzing fear flooded her senses, cold and cloying. Let go of me! Not so fast, widow, Branner snarled, dragging her inexorably towards the cabin entrance, his boots kicking up choking dust. His face was flushed crimson beneath the grime, his breath hot and reeking of whiskey against her cheek. If you ain't got Harrison's map, maybe we work out a different payment arrangement. Harrison always collects what's owed, and this time so do I. Terror threatened to steal her breath, lock her muscles in useless paralysis. She twisted desperately, kicking blindly at his shins, but he was too strong, fueled by avarice and long-nursed resentment. He slammed her roughly against the unyielding log doorframe, pinning her easily with his heavy body, his intentions sickeningly clear in his feral grin. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the blinding shimmer near the parched tree line, coalescing into solid form as if woven from the heat waves themselves. A voice, low calm, yet humming with tightly controlled menace, cut through the suffocating, violence-charged air. Like a honed blade, get your filthy hands off her, Branner. Both Eliza and Branner froze, mid-struggle, momentarily stunned. Standing less than 10 yards distant, materializing as if from the tortured earth, stood Nathan Kade. He looked as if the wilderness had stripped him bare and reforged him. Leaner, harder, weathered by sun and hardship, deeper lines etched around piercing storm-gray eyes that seemed to miss nothing, assessing the scene with glacial calm. The raw intensity radiating from him was unmistakable, a palpable force field of contained violence. He must have approached with the silence of a stalking cougar, using the scrub and contours of the land as cover unseen, unheard. 2 years of agonizing absence dissolved in that single loaded heart-stopping moment. Branner released Eliza so suddenly she nearly fell, staggering back against the rough logs. He spun, aggressively, instinctively, reaching towards his holstered Colt to face the newcomer. Cade! What in the goddamn hell are you doing here? Thought the coyotes picked your bones clean after Sam bought the farm in that slide. Seems I disappointed them, Branner, Nathan replied, his gaze remaining locked on Branner, deliberately ignoring Eliza for the moment, focusing the potent threat like a burning glass. He began to walk forward, slow, deliberate steps that ate the intervening ground, his hands hanging loose and deceptively relaxed at his sides, yet emanating a coiled tension that promised imminent brutal finality. I heard talk of a debt and a map. Samuel Moore owed Harrison nothing. You know it. I know it. And that map, if it exists, describes land. Samuel staked fair and square, unlike some claim jumpers I could name. Branner scoffed, attempting to regain his bluster, though a visible flicker of deep-seated apprehension crossed his face. Cade had a reputation even before he vanished 2 years ago. Quiet, maybe, but possessed of a deadly capability when pushed too far. Stay out of this, Cade. This is Harrison's business, and mine with the widow. He spat the last word. Anything concerning Samuel or Eliza is my business. Nathan stated flatly, his voice unchanging, implacable as the ridge itself. I made Sam a promise. Seems watching time is over. Mount your horse, ride out. Tell Harrison his game ends here. Don't make me tell you again. The direct accusation, claim jumping, visibly hit Branner, confirming Eliza's deepest fears. This wasn't just debt collection. It was theft rooted in past conflict. You threatening me, Drifter? Branner shifted his weight, his right hand hovering consciously, unmistakably near the butt of his holstered pistol. Sweat beaded on his upper lip, despite the dry heat. Just stating the inevitable consequences if you don't. Nathan answered coolly, stopping a calculated 5 feet away. The very air crackled thick with imminent bloodshed, the world seeming to hold its breath. It happened in a blinding, violent instant. Branner, abandoning words, clawed for his gun, desperation making him clumsy. Nathan reacted with astonishing speed, but differently than expected. He didn't draw. Instead, he launched himself forward low and explosively powerful, driving his shoulder hard into Branner's midsection like a battering ram, tackling him hard around the knees. They slammed into the unforgiving dirt, erupting in a choked cloud of dust and mutual curses. Eliza scrambled backward, pressing herself flat against the cabin's rough log wall. Her breath caught tight in her throat, heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The fight was immediate, brutal, devoid of finesse, a primal struggle in the dust. They rolled in the swirling grime, grunting with savage effort, fists landing with sickening wet thuds that echoed oddly in the sudden quiet between impacts. Branner was heavier, bullishly strong, attempting to crush Nathan beneath his weight. But Nathan fought with a focused, desperate ferocity, landing short, punishing blows to Branner's ribs, his face seeking to disable quickly, efficiently. Branner roared, spitting blood and invective, managing to land a looping hard right that snapped Nathan's head back with audible force. For a split second, Nathan seemed stunned, faltering, seizing the precious advantage. Branner scrambled away like a cornered animal, yanking his heavy pistol free from its holster. The sharp metallic double click of the hammer being cocked echoed with terrifying loudness in the sudden dreadful stillness. Nathan. Eliza screamed the name torn from her in pure, unadulterated fear, a raw sound against the backdrop of gathering thunder. Nathan lunged again, trying desperately to cover the ground before Branner could properly aim, reacting with pure instinct. But he was fractionally too late. Branner, fueled by panic rage and the primal instinct to kill or be killed, fired from near point-blank range. The explosion hammered Eliza's ears, a physical blow that momentarily deafened her, leaving a high-pitched ringing. Nathan staggered back violently, as if shoved by an immense invisible hand, his left hand instinctively flying to his left side, clutching just below the ribs. A dark, rapidly spreading stain instantly blossomed on his sweat-soaked dusty shirt, stark against the pale fabric. His face, already pale beneath the grime, turned deathly white, his eyes wide with shock and sudden searing pain. Branner stared eyes wide and momentarily uncomprehending, first at the smoking pistol, trembling in his hand, then at the horrifying bloom of red on Nathan's shirt, a chaotic storm of savage satisfaction warred with sudden, stark fear in his expression. He shot a wild, panicked glance at Eliza, her face a mask of frozen horror against the cabin wall, then back at Nathan, who was swaying ominously, his knees visibly buckling his breath, catching in sharp, agonizing gasps. Without another word, uttering a choked sound somewhere between a curse and a whimper, Branner turned and scrambled frantically for his horse. He hauled himself gracelessly into the saddle and brutally spurred the already nervous animal galloping pell-mell back down the ridge track in a blind, guilty panic, leaving behind only the ringing silence, the acrid stench of gunpowder mingling with the dust, and Nathan Kade bleeding heavily onto the thirsty earth. Eliza surged forward as Nathan collapsed fully to his knees, his breath tearing through his throat in harsh, ragged gasps that spoke horribly of punctured lung. "Nathan," she whispered, her voice choked with rising panic, kneeling beside him in the settling dust that was quickly turning dark and damp beneath him. "Oh, dear God, Nathan, no." He looked up at her somehow, forcing his bloodless lips into a grotesque semblance of a reassuring smile, though his eyes were rapidly clouding with agony and encroaching shock. Always knew how to make dramatic entrance. He wheezed out the words, thick and fading each one an agonizing effort. His eyes lost focus, rolled upward slightly, and he pitched forward heavily into the dirt, unconscious. Panic, cold and sharp, as shattered glass clawed at Eliza's insides. "Not again. I won't lose someone else here. Not like this." Samuel's death had been swift and personal, an uncaring act of indifferent nature's power. This felt violationally different. This was malice, base greed, human violence brought directly, deliberately to her door. She stared down at Nathan, this unexpected ghost from her shared past, inextricably woven into the fabric of her loss, now potentially dying on her doorstep, because he had interposed himself between her and Branner's brutality. He had honored a forgotten promise made across a flickering hearth fire years ago. Resolve, unexpected and fiercely potent, surged through her, shoving back the suffocating blanket of fear. He wasn't Samuel, but he was here hurt for her, and he was miraculously, impossibly still breathing. For now, she couldn't lift him. He was a dead weight, impossibly heavy for her slighter frame, gritting her teeth against a wave of rising nausea threatening to choke her. She grabbed his arms beneath the shoulders, dug her worn boot heels into the loose soil, and began the torturous process of dragging him towards the sanctuary of the cabin. Each inch gained felt like a grueling mile, her muscles screaming in protest. His spreading blood left a dark smeared trail across the parched, indifferent earth. A stark, red accusation against the pale, uncaring canvas of the sky, now heavy with unshed rain. Finally gasping for breath, every muscle, fiber shrieking, she managed to haul him over the rough threshold and into the relative cool and dimness of the small, single room. With one final desperate heave, born of pure adrenaline, she rolled his limp body onto her narrow cot. The only bed in the small dwelling, the rough blankets immediately soaking up the fresh blood. His breathing was now terrifyingly shallow, almost imperceptible, little more than a faint flutter against the overwhelming silence. His skin felt alarmingly cool and clammy to the touch, despite the day's oppressive heat. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she reached for the hem of his blood-stiffened shirt and ripped it upward with frantic urgency. The bullet had entered his left side, high up near the lowest ribs. It was still bleeding freely, not the arterial pumping she half dreaded, but steadily, relentlessly painting the rough fabric of the cot mattress a dark, spreading crimson. She couldn't ascertain the depth, couldn't begin to guess the internal damage, but it wasn't instantly fatal. She prayed fiercely, desperately. There was still time. There had to be time. Action became her shield against encroaching despair. Grabbed the water bucket, blessedly recently filled before Branner's arrival, her cleanest rags tearing them swiftly into usable strips with shaking hands. She worked with a frantic, focused efficiency born of terror, her mind surprisingly mercifully clear, for the moment concentrating only on the immediate necessary tasks ahead. Cleaned the wound as best she could, the precious water turning progressively pink, then red, swirling with grime. Searched the sparse shelves, her eyes falling on the half-full bottle of cheap, harsh whiskey Samuel had kept mostly untouched for medicinal emergencies, or the rare celebratory moment that never seemed to come. Uncorking it clumsily, with her teeth spitting the cork aside onto the dusty floorboards. She hesitated only a second before pouring a shockingly generous amount directly into the raw, puckered wound. Nathan's unconscious body arched violently reflexively off the cot, with a strangled, inhuman groan ripped from his depths, reacting instinctively to the fiery sting, then subsided limply back onto the stain ticking, his breathing, perhaps hitching a fraction deeper, for a painful second. Good pain meant life. Please God, let it mean life. Now the most difficult part. She retrieved her sturdiest needle, the curved one reserved for stitching thick leather harness, and threaded it with heavy waxed linen thread. Her fingers clumsy at first, then finding their accustomed surety despite the tremors. Taking a deep, steadying breath that scraped her dry throat, she pierced the skin near the ragged edge of the wound. Her stomach churned violently, threatening revolt bile rising bitter in her throat, but her hands remained remarkably steady, guided by years of intricate sewing and a desperate surge of will. Stitch by slow, deliberate, excruciating stitch, she began the grim task of closing the gaping hole in his side. The curved needle dipped and rose through unwilling flesh, pulling the torn edges tentatively together. An intimate, gruesome act of battlefield, mending performed under the flickering light of a single oil lamp she hastily lit against the deepening gloom. From the storm clouds outside, blood welled up around each suture, slippery and dark. With every careful pull of the thread, tightening the fragile barrier against death, fragmented memories flickered behind her eyes, unbidden sharp, as newly broken glass, Nathan and Samuel working shoulder to shoulder in the brilliant mountain sunshine, grunting with shared effort as they hoisted the main roof beam of this very cabin into place. Their easy laughter echoing brightly in the clear, thin air, full of planes and shared dreams. Nathan, exhibiting infinite quiet patience, teaching her how to read the subtle signs of deer passage on the forest floor. His quiet competence a perfect counterpoint to Samuel's more boisterous energy. Samuel, one long evening, by the flickering hearth fire pipe, smoke curling towards the rafters, speaking of Nathan with deep, unguarded affection and absolute trust. He's got wanderlust deep in his bones, Eliza thorns in his boots from places I can't even imagine name. But his heart, it's true, truer than tempered steel, truer than any man I've ever known. And then the words that now resonated with a chilling prophetic weight, echoing in the small, blood-scented cabin. If anything ever happens to me up here, Nate, you look out for Eliza. Promise me she'll be all alone. Nathan's solemn, unhesitating nod, his intense gray gaze meeting Samuel's across the dancing flames, a silent, unbreakable vow exchanged between them. Always Sam. You know I will. He had promised. And today he had brutally, potentially lethally fulfilled that promise. Why now? Why surface after 2 long years of silence, of presumed disappearance, perhaps even death? Had he somehow heard Branner making threats in the settlement below? Or had he been closer than she knew all along? The unseen watcher, whose presence she had felt bound invisibly, but inextricably, by that solemn fireside oath. The profound guilt she'd glimpsed in his eyes at Samuel's stark, hurried burial. Was it purely survivor's guilt? The random cruelty of the landslide, sparing him while taking his partner? Or something deeper, more complicated, tied perhaps to Branner's ugly insinuations about partnership and betrayal? Questions swirled a confusing vortex of fear and suspicion, but they were secondary, irrelevant noise against the immediate harsh reality. Nathan Kade was here, bleeding profusely onto her cot. His life now, hanging precariously suspended by the thin linen thread in her trembling hands. Tears welled suddenly hot and unexpected, blurring her vision, making the needlepoint waver. She hadn't cried for Nathan's disappearance 2 years ago, swallowed as she was by the overwhelming enormity of Samuel's sudden violent loss. Now the tears were a tangled torrent for both men, for the irrevocably snarled mess of loyalty, grief, secrets, betrayal, and brutal violence that had finally explosively converged on this lonely, windswept ridge. She dashed them away impatiently, with the back of her forearm staining the rough wool of her sleeve. Tears wouldn't stop the bleeding. Stitching might. She finished the last suture, knotted the thick thread securely several times, and snipped it clean with her teeth. Applied a thick pad, fashioned from folded clean cloth, binding it tightly around his torso with long strips of torn sheeting. Pulled her heaviest quilt over him, tucking it carefully around his still worryingly cool form, despite the humid pre-storm air. Then, utterly exhausted, drained emotionally and physically, she simply sat in the single, uncomfortable, straight-backed wooden chair, pulled close beside the narrow cot. She sat and watched him, straining to hear the faint, ragged whisper of his breath in the stifling, tomb-like quiet of the cabin. Samuel's heavy Winchester now lay across her lap, the cold steel a stark, unsettling contrast against her worn skirt fabric. The cabin door was securely barred. The silence pressing in from outside felt different now, no longer empty and lonely, but watchful, pregnant with imminent renewed threat. Branner had fled. Yes, but he was humiliated, potentially implicated in attempted murder if Nathan survived, and likely pathologically furious. He knew Nathan was gravely wounded, perhaps dying. He knew she was alone with him, and crucially, he knew or strongly suspected about the map. A map he felt entitled to, a map connected to Samuel's death, a supposed partnership, and a past betrayal. He seemed determined to avenge or profit from. He wouldn't simply vanish into the valley haze. He wouldn't let this stand. Eliza knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in her bones, a cold counterpoint to the simmering heat trapped in the cabin, that Kyle Branner would return. And this time, he would not come back alone. The ensuing days dissolved into a distorted, timeless miasma of exhausting vigilance and desperate nursing. Eliza existed in a state of raw, hyper-awareness, catching sleep in brief, uncomfortable snatches slumped in the hard chair. The Winchester always within arm's reach, her senses perpetually strained, jumping violently at every nighttime creak of the cabin's settling timbers, every rustle of wind. Driven debris against the rough-hewn logs, every mournful cry of a distant coyote echoing across the darkening ridge. Nathan remained submerged in the shadowy borderland between life and death, anchored tenuously by her clumsy ministrations. A fierce fever took hold within hours, gripping him in its relentless cycle of burning heat that radiated off his skin and bone-chilling shudders that shook the narrow cot. He thrashed against the rough confines, muttering streams of incomprehensible words, fragmented names, Samuel's often repeated with agonizing guilt, but also others she didn't recognize, fractured sentences hinting darkly at a past deliberately obscured by dust distance and perhaps deception. At times, the delirium peeled back layers of his tightly guarded reserve, offering horrifying, disjointed glimpses into the shadowed corners of his recent past and Samuel's end. The rope, main support, frayed clean through. Should have checked it myself. Damn it, Sam. Branner near the south beam. Saw him. Tamperin switched it. My fault, Sam. God, my fault. His voice thick with fever and an ancient suffocating guilt seemed to confirm her darkest fears about the landslide. Had Branner deliberately engineered Samuel's death? Eliza tried to push the chilling thought away, her stomach twisting. Delirium manufactures monsters from fear and fever. Doesn't it? The coordinates N37, W105, LAT, Cade claim. Marker that's mine right beside ours. Vane crossed over, told Sam big enough for both. Don't trust Branner. Harrison knows, he mumbled later. Voice trailing off, directly connecting the cryptic map notation to himself, revealing his own prior stake. The overlapping strike and Branner and Harrison's avaricious interest. It wasn't just Samuel's find. It was theirs, straddling the line, a fortune ripe for theft by the ruthless. She bathed his flushed face and burning chest repeatedly with cool water, drawn sparingly now from the dwindling barrel, the distant thunder having dissipated without yielding a single precious drop of rain. Forced sips of thin, salted broth or weak, bitter willowbark tea between his cracked, parched lips, whenever he surfaced briefly, agonizingly, from the depths of the fever. Dreams his eyes clouded and unseeing. She changed the crude dressing, frequently needing to tear strips from her own spare petticoat, as the rags ran out, fighting back waves of despair. Each time she saw the angry, inflamed redness surrounding the clumsy stitches, the unmistakable telltale signs of infection consolidating its insidious hold. The wound seeped a foul-smelling yellowish fluid that stained the bandages. Doubt became a gnawing parasite within her, feeding on her fatigue and fear. Was she doing enough? Was she doing the right things? She was no doctor, merely a solitary woman armed with fierce desperation. The rudimentary, hard-won medical knowledge gleaned from a lifetime of frontier living and a dwindling hope. The small, hard lump she'd felt near the wound when first stitching, still there under the swollen tissue, probing gently during a dressing change, convinced now it wasn't just swelling. Or a bone fragment, she realized, with a jolt, it felt unnaturally smooth, yet resistant, like hammered flattened lead. A bullet fragment lodged deep. Or perhaps older shrapnel, something embedded during the landslide itself. Another secret embedded deep within his flesh, mirroring the secrets held in his past. She didn't dare try to remove it, terrified of causing uncontrollable bleeding or driving the tenacious infection deeper into his already ravaged body. In his brief, scattered moments of fragile lucidity, Nathan's pain-filled eyes would focus sharply on her face, reflecting raw agony, profound gratitude, and an overwhelming soul-deep weariness that seemed to crush him. "Eliza," he rasped, once his uninjured right hand weakly attempting to bridge the narrow space between cot and chair to reach for hers. "Sorry, brought this down on you." "Hush," she commanded softly, laying her cooler hand over his hot, dry one, feeling the frantic, thready pulse beating weakly beneath his skin like a trapped moth. "Save your strength. Nathan, just rest now. Branner, he knows about the map." He began again, his brow furrowing with a worry that seemed to transcend the physical pain consuming him. "Harrison wants that strike lat K marker." "He hasn't come back," she reassured him, though the lie felt thin and brittle, even to her own ears, cracking under the weight of certainty. She hadn't seen Branner himself, but twice now, venturing out cautiously at dawn for firewood, she'd found fresh, deliberately placed horse tracks just beyond the edge of the clearing tracks that led back down towards the valley floor. Someone was still watching, biding their time, waiting. Perhaps waiting for him to die. "We're safe for now." His haunted gray eyes searched hers intently, seeking truth. He likely knew, wasn't there, finding only her forced, precarious composure, her own exhaustion mirrored in the shadows beneath her eyes. He seemed about to impart something else, something vital, judging by the sudden urgency in his expression. But another wave of intense pain washed visibly over his face, tightening his features into a grimace. And he closed his eyes with a faint groan, his breathing becoming terrifyingly shallow once more. During one particularly long night vigil, the silence broken only by the frantic ticking of her own pulse drumming in her ears and his labored rasping breathing under the flickering, unsteady lamplight that cast monstrous dancing shadows on the log walls, she finally retrieved the map from Samuel's chest. Carefully unfolding the stiff, oiled buckskin, she held it where the dim light fell across the cot. Even semi-conscious, drifting in the fever's fog, his eyes fixed on it with immediate startling recognition. "Lat K." He breathed his forefinger weakly, tremulously, tracing the coordinates written near the canyon fork drawing Cade marker. Mine next to Samuel's original stake. He found color straddling the line. Big strike. Enough for partners. Branner saw the samples Sam brought down, got greedy. Tried to scare Sam off, tamper with boundary stakes, threaten, then the slide. Harrison funded Branner, always watching. His voice trailed off into incoherent delirium. Again the name Harrison, repeated like a curse, but the fractured pieces formed a damning concrete picture. Samuel hadn't just found gold. He'd found it overlapping a claim Nathan had previously marked, perhaps even prospected lightly before moving on. Branner and Harrison coveted both adjacent claims. The landslide hadn't just been tragic, it had been murderously convenient, perhaps even directly facilitated. Branner wasn't just collecting a fabricated debt. He was ruthlessly eliminating witnesses and attempting to seize a stolen treasure built on betrayal and blood. Later that same night, needing cleaner cloth, sorting desperately through Samuel's few stored possessions in the rough wooden chest beneath the cot, her fingers brushed against something else tucked away beneath the worn shirts. A small leather-bound pocket journal. Samuel hadn't been one for writing, beyond necessary tallies and supply lists. Curiosity sharp and insistent peeked through her exhaustion. She opened it carefully under the lamp. Inside, in Samuel's rough practical hand, were sparse notations about the claim's progress, frustrations with dwindling supplies, worries about making ends meet. Confirming again her unwavering belief he hadn't borrowed a cent from Harrison. And then an entry, dated just 2 days before the fatal slide, stark and chilling in its prescience. KB getting aggressive past few weeks. Found north boundary marker moved again this morning. Threatened me direct when confronted down by the creek. Said the claim was his by rights through Harrison. Something feels badly wrong. Left word for Nate down at settlement to watch his back up here. Taking precautions myself. Precautions. What precautions could Samuel have taken alone against men like Branner and Harrison? Had he suspected more than just claim jumping and intimidation? Had he sensed Branner was capable of murder? The journal confirmed Branner's long-standing hostility, Samuel's growing unease, and his reliance on Nathan's absent presence. Almost a full week crawled by under this heavy shroud of sickness, suspicion, and suffocating suspense. Supplies reached critical lows. The flour sack yielded only a depressing half-cupful. The coffee grounds had been boiled past bitterness into little more than brown water. Eliza began strictly rationing their dwindling water supply, her own throat perpetually dry. The subtle signs of surveillance persisted. A deliberately displaced rock on the trail. She hadn't disturbed those unnerving tracks, reappearing just outside the lamplight's weak flickering glow after she'd carefully scuffed over the previous set. Then one evening, as twilight bled violet and orange across the sky, distinct and undeniable, the faint but definite flicker of a distant campfire nestled deep in the valley shadows below, strategically positioned to observe the only track leading up to her isolated cabin. They weren't just watching passively anymore. They were settled and waiting, preparing their next move. Waiting, she knew, with cold certainty for Nathan to die, making their grim task simpler, cleaner, or perhaps just waiting for their numbers to increase. Then on the morning of the 6th day, dawn breaking cool and crystalline after a night of fitful wind that finally cleared the oppressive heat, the fever broke as suddenly as it had arrived. Nathan awoke properly, his eyes clear and startlingly aware, though deeply shadowed with profound exhaustion and residual pain. He looked ravaged, depleted, almost skeletal, but the essential spark of his formidable spirit, the core of quiet steel she remembered, had returned. His gaze moved slowly around the small, cluttered cabin, lingering assessingly on the Winchester propped beside Eliza's chair, then fixed on her own weary, grime-streaked face, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the strain around her mouth. "How long?" he asked, his voice raspy, cracked, but significantly stronger, more present than before. 6 days, she replied, the sudden overwhelming wave of relief that flooded her, making her voice tremble uncontrollably, tears pricking hotly behind her eyelids. 6 days since? Branner shot you. The fever was bad. Nathan nearly took you more than once. The infection? It's still there, I think. He nodded slowly, absorbing the lost time, the grim reality of his condition. He touched his heavily bandaged side, gingerly, his face tightening at the inevitable pain. Still breathing, though. A statement of fact hard won. Still breathing, she confirmed, softly pulling her chair closer. She told him then about the tracks, the constant feeling of being watched, the brazen campfire in the valley. And she told him about finding Samuel's journal, about the chilling final entry, confirming Branner's threats, the claim tampering. Finally, voice low and heavy, she recounted his own delirious words, connecting Branner directly to the sabotaged mine supports the map, the Cade claim marker Lat K. Harrison's backing the overlapping strike. Nathan absorbed this bleak torrent of information, grimly, his face tightening into harsh lines, the pieces clicking into a horrifying complete picture of calculated murder and betrayal. He has to come back. Eliza, now sooner, rather than later. He can't risk me living to tell what I saw near the supports that day, what I know now for sure. And Harrison's greedy enough to kill for rumor, ruthless enough to burn the world down for a proven strike like this one. He won't abandon a potential fortune, not when he thinks only you and a wounded man stand between him and it. He grimaced, pushing himself painstakingly up onto one elbow, sweat instantly beading on his pale forehead from the sheer effort. The movement pulled at the wound, and a low groan escaped him. Need my gun, Eliza. Where is it? You're nowhere near strong enough for that Nathan. You can barely sit up. Stronger with it than without it. He countered immediately, his jaw setting in that familiar, stubborn line that reminded her so achingly fiercely of Samuel. He swung his legs carefully over the side of the cot, swaying precariously for a long moment, knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the thin mattress for support. Pain etched deep lines around his mouth, turning his lips pale, but fierce determination burned brightly in his clear gray eyes. Help me up, please. Zah reluctantly filled with a deep cold foreboding that prickled her skin. Eliza rose and supported his surprisingly frail weight as he staggered the few feet across the small cabin floor to the rough-hewn table, where his cleaned Colt revolver and gun belt lay meticulously arranged exactly as she had left them after cleaning them days ago. His fingers clumsy and weak at first, from the fever and blood loss, eventually found their old assurance, expertly checking the cylinder, by feel and sound, ensuring all 6 chambers were loaded. 6 shots. Samuel's Winchester, leaning against the wall near the door, held 5 more 11 bullets. 11 bullets against... How many returning shadows climbing the ridge from that valley campfire? As if summoned by the grim, unspoken calculus of their desperate conversation, the dreaded sound drifted upward, carried with unnerving clarity on the still, cool morning air. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving with unified, purposeful rhythm, climbing the steep ridge track towards the cabin, clearing, not hesitant, scouting this time. This was the deliberate, confident sound of imminent arrival. The final brutal reckoning. Eliza and Nathan exchanged a single long look across the suddenly claustrophobic space of the small cabin. A look heavy with grim resignation, shared understanding of the impossible odds, yet underscored by an unbreakable quiet resolve, forged in shared loss and immediate peril. Eliza flew to the door, grabbing the familiar solid weight of the Winchester from its pegs. The smooth, worn wood, paradoxically solid and strangely comforting in her trembling grasp. She worked the lever action smoothly, chambering around. The solid, definitive click seemed unnaturally loud, echoing starkly in the sudden, intense silence that fell within the cabin, broken only by Nathan's harsh breathing. Nathan braced his weakened body against the doorframe, using the solid wood for support. The heavy Colt held low, but steady in his right hand, instinctively compensating for the wounded left arm, now bound tightly across his chest in a sling, fashioned from a torn shirt. He was terrifyingly pale, sweat plastering strands of dark hair to his forehead, leaning heavily, clearly fighting waves of pain and dizziness, but his gun hand miraculously was rock steady. "Eliza!" he began again, his voice strained, urgent. "The back window. Shutters loose. Pry it open. Run for the rocks behind the cabin. Lose them in the boulders. Hide. I can hold them here long enough." "No." She cut him off decisively, her voice ringing with a newfound fierceness she hadn't known she possessed, absolute and final. "Samuel built this home with his bare hands. You bled defending it, defending me. I'm not running. Not anymore. We face them together." She took her designated position beside him, pressing her cheek against the rough, splintery wood of the door, peering through a narrow crack between the warped planks. 5 riders broke simultaneously from the lower trail's meager tree cover, fanning out deliberately as they approached the small clearing, moving with the chilling confidence of predators closing in on trapped prey. Kyle Branner sat hunched at their head, his face a contorted mask of cold fury and visible pain from his hastily bandaged left leg, clearly still agony from where Nathan had tackled him days earlier. But it hadn't stopped him. The 4 men flanking him were unmistakable hard cases, hired guns drawn from the rougher elements that drifted through the territory. Faces shuttered and emotionless rifles held loosely, but ready across their saddles. One man, significantly ominously, carried a lit torch, its greedy yellow flame flickering obscenely, licking hungrily at the clean dawn light. A blatant, terrifying statement of their ultimate intent. They drew rein about 30 yards out, forming a deadly, menacing tableau against the rapidly brightening eastern sky, trapping the small cabin in a semicircle of impending violence. "Morning, folks!" Branner called out, his voice laced with a grating false cheer that didn't reach his deadened, hate-filled eyes. "Figured we'd come back nice and early to conclude our unfinished business. Wouldn't want to keep the buzzards waiting." He saw Nathan standing improbably upright, grievously wounded, but armed and defiant in the doorway. A flicker of genuine surprise, perhaps even grudging respect, crossed Branner's face, quickly masked by a contemptuous sneer. "Well, now Cade appearances really are deceiving tougher than you look after all. Or maybe just too damn stupid to die peaceful when you get the chance." "Get off this land, Branner," Eliza yelled back, amazed again at the surprising steadiness of her own voice. The solid weight of the Winchester against her shoulder felt like an extension of her own hardened resolve. "This is more land bought and paid for. Oh, I plan on taking possession of this land." Branner spat back his smirk, widening into a vicious snarl that exposed stained teeth. "Soon as I get what Samuel stole from Harrison, stole from me, the backstabbing cheat," he spat the word "me" like venom confirming the hinted-at partnership. That map details the richest strike this side of the Rockies, staked right over my own damn prior claim line. He thought he could cut me out, him and his drifter friend. He was a thief and a liar. Hand it over, widow. Hand it over. And maybe we let Cade here bleed out somewhat peaceful, instead of burning him out like the nestin' rat he is. He looked pointedly meaningfully at the man holding the flickering torch. Nathan shifted his weight, almost imperceptibly, against the doorframe, his knuckles showing white where he gripped the worn walnut handle of the Colt. Only thing you'll get measured for here is a pine box Branner. You first. Branner laughed again, that raw, ugly sound that grated on the nerves like fingernails on slate. He gestured expansively with a gloved hand to his heavily armed men. Still defiant. Hear that, boys? 5 guns to 2 cripples. And one of 'em looks like death warmed over already. This ain't gonna take long. He fixed his furious gaze back on Nathan, malice twisting his features. Remember how easy those old timbers gave way down in the canyon cut, Cade. Remember hearing Samuel screaming as the rocks came down. Maybe you should have checked that main support beam yourself after all. Like I told you, I thought it looked rotten. Pity you didn't listen. The sickening implication, the veiled, bragging confession, hung poisonously palpably in the tense morning air. Branner hadn't just hoped for the slide. He'd actively, murderously facilitated it. Samuel's death was cold-blooded murder for greed. Branner gave a curt, savage nod to his men. Enough talk. Now burn them out and shoot anything that crawls clear. The world exploded into sheer, deafening pandemonium. A ragged cacophony of gunfire ripped through the morning quiet, like tearing canvas muzzle flashes, stabbing violently at the pale air from multiple directions. Chips of wood and shards of bark exploded inward from the cabin wall perilously close to Eliza's head. She ducked reflexively. Instinct screaming. Instantly brought the Winchester smoothly up, found a target. The rider directly beside Branner, who was aiming carefully at Nathan's exposed position in the doorway. Took a short, sharp breath, held against the pounding in her chest, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. A familiar grounding jolt. The rider jerked spasmodically, dropping his rifle, as if it suddenly burned him hands, flying reflexively to clutch his chest as he slumped lifelessly forward over his horse's neck. A dead weight. Nathan fired simultaneously, his Colt barking twice in rapid, controlled succession, despite his obvious weakness. Another rider cried out sharply, grabbing instinctively at his shoulder, blood appearing dark on his sleeve as he wheeled his panicked horse back clumsily out of the immediate line of fire, seeking the dubious cover of the sparse tree line. Branner's remaining 3 men unleashed a furious return volley, a terrifying hail of lead thudding heavily into the thick cabin logs, like angry fists, slugs, whining viciously past the doorway, opening with lethal intent, several punching fist-sized holes clean through the thinner back wall, near the cold hearth, showering the interior with splinters. A stray bullet, maybe a ricochet off the doorframe, tore through the already wounded flesh of Nathan's upper left arm. The brutal impact spinning him half around with a choked grunt. He stumbled heavily, nearly falling, but caught himself brutally against the doorframe, his face contorting in fresh agony, sweat dripping from his chin. Without hesitation, ignoring the new searing pain, he brought the Colt around again with his steady right hand, firing deliberately, methodically, forcing the third active rider to abandon his exposed approach and dive frantically for scant cover behind a scraggly, inadequate creosote bush near the edge of the clearing. The map Damn you! Branner roared, maniacally over the deafening din of continuous gunfire, firing his own pistol, recklessly wildly, towards the shadowy doorway, while trying simultaneously to shield his vulnerable body behind his increasingly agitated horse. Give it up, widow. It proves he cheated me. It's mine by rights. Eliza ignored his crazed, desperate demands. Cold, clear fury guided her actions, now sharpening her senses, slowing time. Samuel's memory, Nathan's selfless sacrifice bleeding out beside her, the utter violation of her home, the final sickening confirmation of Branner's murderous treachery. It all coalesced into a single laser-sharp point of deadly focus. She saw Branner fumbling awkwardly to reload his pistol, momentarily exposed beside his dancing horse. She lined up the shot, calmly, deliberately, breathed out slowly, and fired. The bullet struck his horse squarely in the thick neck. The animal screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure equine terror, and agony reared violently backward, eyes rolling white, and collapsed sideways like a felled tree, once again pinning Branner's leg. This time, his good one. Underneath its immense shuddering weight, he bellowed a raw, guttural symphony of excruciating pain and completely thwarted rage. Seeing their leader downed again, momentarily helpless beneath the thrashing horse, the two remaining able-bodied men, the one nursing a shoulder wound near the trees and the one hunkered behind the bush, hesitated for a crucial heartbeat, their confidence visibly shaken. But the man with the torch, apparently uninjured, saw his opening amidst the chaos. He wasn't aiming for the vulnerable roof thatch this time. Spurring his horse hard, ignoring the bullets whining past him, he galloped directly towards the cabin, holding the torch low and forward like a lance, clearly intending to thrust it bodily into the open doorway itself. Hoping to ignite the dry interior, the bedding, the meager supplies forced them out into the open. Nathan the torch. Eliza screamed the warning momentarily, unable to get a clear shot herself, past Nathan's position. Nathan, bleeding profusely now, from both his side and his freshly torn arm. His face, a terrifying mask of sheer agony and inhuman effort, reacted instantly. Knowing he couldn't stop the rider from his braced position, he deliberately forcefully pushed himself away from the supporting wall. He took two incredibly unsteady, staggering steps forward, intentionally moving out of the doorway's relative protection into the line of fire, raising the Colt in a two-handed grip that must have caused unimaginable tearing pain in his injured side and arm. He fired just as the rider leaned low from the saddle, preparing to plunge the burning brand inside the heat already scorching the air. The bullet struck the man squarely in the chest with stunning force. He arched backward as if poleaxed, propelled from the saddle, the torch flying harmlessly from his grasp, landing fizzing impotently in the dirt several yards away, before he tumbled heavily bonelessly to the ground, dead before he hit the dust. But Nathan was completely exposed, utterly vulnerable, a perfect target. Branner trapped beneath his dying horse, but far from disabled, fueled by incandescent hatred, twisted his torso with a furious grunt of effort. Ignoring the crushing weight on his leg, grabbed his fallen pistol from the dusty ground where it had landed nearby, took swift, careful aim at Nathan's unprotected back, and fired. The heavy slug caught Nathan low, terrifyingly close to the base of his spine. A choked gasp abruptly cut off escaped him. His legs gave out instantly, completely, as if their connection to his brain had been severed. He crumpled straight down to the ground, like a string-cut puppet, his Colt clattering uselessly onto the blood-soaked earth from his suddenly nerveless fingers. "Nathan!" Eliza screamed again. The sound ripped raw from her throat, laced with pure unadulterated agony and despair, echoing horribly against the sudden cessation of gunfire. Seeing Nathan fall, definitively, seeing Eliza momentarily frozen in horror at the doorway, the last two riders, the one wounded in the shoulder by the trees and the uninjured one who'd sought cover behind the bush, regained their shattered nerve. Hope surged anew. The uninjured man bolted from behind the bush rifle, blazing charging towards the cabin, laying down covering fire. The shoulder-wounded man, seeing his chance while Eliza was distracted, didn't charge, but began circling cautiously on horseback, trying to get a clear line of sight at Eliza through the small side window near the hearth. A bullet smashed through the precious glass pane Eliza had bartered 3 months of sewing work for spraying sharp shards inward, stinging her cheek. Another slug thudded into the log wall near her head. Something inside Eliza Moore didn't just snap. It sheared off cleanly, leaving behind only a core of glacial lethal resolve honed by grief, desperation, and fury. Grief, fear, exhaustion. It all distilled, compressed by the violence, into icy purpose. She wasn't just defending anymore. She was ending this, now before they reached Nathan. She swung the Winchester smoothly back towards the charging man, firing from the hip instinctively. The shot went slightly wide, kicking up spurts of dirt near his running feet, but close enough to make him instinctively check his stride, veering sharply aside. As he momentarily wrestled for balance, recovering his aim, she calmly automatically levered another round into the chamber, brought the rifle stock firmly to her shoulder, blocking out the pain. The fear aimed with deadly precision down the long barrel and fired. He tumbled backward like a discarded sack of grain landing heavily in the dust. Still, only one rider left mobile, the shoulder-wounded one, circling, plus Branner pinned and raging uselessly beneath his dead horse. The last active threat fired again through the side window, the bullet whining past Eliza's ear and embedding itself with a solid thwack in the opposite wall near the cold fireplace. She ignored the stinging spray of wood splinters, ignored the whine of the bullet, reloaded smoothly, deliberately, one bullet left in the Winchester's magazine. She stepped decisively out of the doorway, fully exposed now in the harsh morning light, scanning the carnage-strewn clearing for the final danger. He was dismounting cautiously now behind the meager cover of the same cluster of rocks where his companion had fallen earlier, rifle being brought carefully up to aim at her exposed position. Branner, meanwhile, was thrashing frantically beneath the dead weight of his horse, inhuman sounds tearing from his throat as he struggled fruitlessly to free his crushed leg, cursing her, cursing Nathan, cursing Samuel, cursing Harrison, cursing his own damnable luck. His pistol lay on the ground beside him, momentarily forgotten, but still within desperate reach. Eliza made a split-second tactical decision. Branner, immobilized, but consumed by hatred and potentially still armed, remained the most immediate venomous threat, if he could just reach his gun. The last rider was maneuvering more cautiously, seeking a clean, unhurried shot. One bullet left in the Winchester. She took a single steadying breath, felt the familiar weight of the rifle settle naturally against her shoulder, centering herself in the midst of chaos, and aimed with cold, deliberate care at Kyle Branner's exposed, struggling torso. "This is for Samuel." She whispered the words, swallowed instantly by the vast, sudden silence of the ridge, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was true. Branner's body jerked violently. Once a final galvanic paroxysm of effort or agony, then went utterly finally still. Eyes wide and staring sightlessly at the indifferent blue sky. The last rider poked his head warily up from behind the rocks, rifle poised ready to fire, Eliza met his wide, terrified eyes across the deadly, suddenly silent, sun-drenched space. He saw Branner, lying dead, twisted obscenely beneath the carcass of his horse. He saw his four companions strewn brokenly, lifelessly across the blood-soaked clearing, like discarded puppets. He saw the widow standing alone and resolute amidst the shocking, unbelievable carnage. The long barrel of the Winchester held steady, pointing roughly in his direction. Smoke curling faintly from the muzzle, her face grim, streaked with soot and blood. Her eyes blazing with a terrifying preternatural calmness that promised only swift, certain death. He saw his own imminent annihilation staring back at him across the sunlit dust. Slowly, deliberately shaking visibly, he lowered his rifle to the ground. His empty hands shot up high above his head in abject trembling surrender. Then scrambling with desperate panicked haste, not even retrieving his rifle, he flung himself onto the nearest riderless horse, not his own, and spurred it frantically, mercilessly down the ridge track, disappearing like a guilt-ridden phantom into the shimmering heat haze of the valley below, leaving only the dead and the wounded behind. Silence crashed down, absolute deafening after the protracted roar of gunfire, broken only by the incessant indifferent whistle of the wind threading through the high rocks and the distressed, high-pitched panting of the remaining terrified horses' reins trailing in the bloody dust. The acrid metallic tang of gunpowder hung heavy and bitter in the cool morning air, mingling nauseatingly with the scent of blood and death. 5 bodies now littered the clearing surrounding the small, bullet-scarred, suddenly besieged cabin. Eliza stood alone, solitary, swaying slightly, with exhaustion in the midst of the brutal aftermath, the Winchester suddenly feeling impossibly leadenly heavy in her trembling hands. Her gaze flew instantly fearfully to Nathan. He lay face down where he had fallen, unnervingly, horribly still. Dropping the rifle carelessly, as if it suddenly burned her hands, she ran towards him, stumbling over the uneven, blood-stained ground, finally falling to her knees in the rapidly drying dust beside his inert form. "Nathan, Nathan, answer me, please." With trembling, frantic hands, she gently, carefully rolled him over onto his back. His eyes were closed, his face waxen alarmingly pale beneath the layers of grime, sweat, and fresh blood. The bullet wound in his back looked horribly low, terrifyingly close to his spine, the fabric around it dark and saturated. The older wound in his side had torn open again during the fierce struggle, bleeding freely once more, staining the ground dark beneath him. His breathing. She pressed her ear close to his lips, praying frantically. It was faint, dangerously shallow, almost non-existent, a mere flutter against the profound stillness. Tears streamed down her face, now hot and unchecked, blurring the horrific scene as she pressed her hands fiercely against the renewed bleeding in his side, trying desperately, futilely, perhaps to staunch the flow with direct pressure. "No!" She sobbed aloud, the sound torn violently from the very depths of her soul, a raw cry against fate. "No, you don't get to do this. Not now. Not after everything you promised Samuel. You promised him. You don't get to die." Faintly at first, then growing steadily louder, carried clearly on the relentless wind sweeping down the ridge, she heard it. More hoofbeats, many this time, ascending rapidly, purposefully from the valley floor. The prolonged, intense firefight must have echoed clearly all the way down to the settlement, the townsfolk. The sheriff, inevitably, coming to investigate the miniature war that had erupted on Redemption Ridge. They would be here soon. They would find this this abattoir. 5 dead men, 1 lone blood-spattered woman survivor, and a grievously wounded man dying at her feet. Eliza looked down at Nathan's still face, barely recognizable beneath the blood and grime, yet undeniably him. He had clawed his way back from oblivion, drawn perhaps by the fading anchor of an old promise. He had fought like a demon possessed, bled profusely, willingly, taken bullets, undoubtedly meant for her, shielded her life with the last vestiges of his own formidable strength and spirit. He had faced down Branner's festering greed and murderous violence. He had inadvertently confirmed the lethal secret of Samuel's map. The overlapping claims the truth that had cost Samuel his life and nearly claimed Nathan's twice over. He had given absolutely everything. Let the townsfolk deal with the bodies, with the inevitable questions, with the sheriff's cautious investigation. Let them puzzle over the 5 dead men sprawled in the dust, the brands on the horses, the connection to Harrison. Let them gawk at the lone blood-stained woman survivor standing amidst the carnage. Eliza Moore had only one focus, one desperate purpose. Now Nathan Kade had kept his promise to Samuel at devastating cost. Now she would keep an unspoken, fiercely felt one to him. He had faced death head-on for her repeatedly. She would face it down alongside him now, battling fiercely for every single shallow, fluttering breath he took. She pressed harder against the weeping wound in his side, leaned closer again, listening intently, desperately, to the faint, almost imperceptible whisper of air escaping his bloodless lips. His pulse, thready and weak beneath her trembling fingertips at his throat, was still there. Faint, but there. He was still alive, barely clinging on by the most fragile of threads, but alive. He had taken bullets for her honor, for her safety. He had faced down impossible odds for her survival. He had honored a dead friend's sacred final request at devastating personal cost. And now surrounded by death, enveloped by the vast, uncaring sky, washing clean over Redemption Ridge, Eliza Moore made a silent, unbreakable vow. He would not die alone. She would hold on. She would fight alongside him for every heartbeat. She would be his anchor in this violent, bloody storm, just as his sudden, unexpected reappearance had impossibly been hers. Tucking the folded, precious buckskin map, Samuel's deadly legacy, Branner's obsession, Harrison's motive, and perhaps now, their only path to justice, securely back into the bodice of her dress, she looked up, eyes blazing with fierce resolve, preparing to meet the arriving riders. Not as a victim cowering in fear, but as a survivor forged in the crucible of violence, ready to demand justice, not just for herself, but for Samuel, and for the man whose faint, ragged breaths whispered life's fragile persistence against her ear. His eyelids fluttered again, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. He moaned softly, a sound of deep, distant pain. He was still fighting, and so would she. The ridge and the dangerous fortune it guarded would yield its secrets in time. Justice first, then somehow truth, and then perhaps against all odds a chance at life together. He would live. She would see to it.